What's up, everybody? Eric here. Welcome back to the Outlier podcast. I got my friends from Doomberg back on, my favorite green chicken. I think maybe the only green chicken that I'm aware of, but welcome back to the podcast. Great to have you.
Eric, great to be back with you.
So it's been about a quarter since we've spoken last, and maybe like a lot has happened. Also, not. I guess there's always a lot happening, but I thought it would be cool to start with looking back at 2023 and from your purview as a whole, two things. First, what stood out to you? And two, how did things progress against expectations for you?
Great questions. And first of all, great to be back with you. I always enjoy our conversations, and it's going to be a fun one today. The thing that jumps out to us in 2023, first and foremost, is the lack of a recession in the US. I think the consensus view heading into the year was the Fed couldn't raise rates at the speed with which they were intending to without destroying the economy. You know, they're going to raise until they break something, was the common knowledge on FinTwit and in much of the punditry class, of which we're a charter member. So that's meant not as a derogatory term. And also, I think there was consistent, or sort of as an auxiliary observation to that, there was this view, which we held, that the US was probably reaching its capacity to produce hydrocarbons, and the shale patch would roll over. And the big aha for us during the year is neither of those materialized. The US kept producing record-breaking month after record-breaking month of oil and NGLs and natural gas, and even exported a record of volume or value of coal. And also the US did not slip into a recession. And, you know, as an analyst, when you get something wrong, what matters most is what you learn from it. And the difference between an analyst and advocate is an analyst seeks to understand as opposed to an advocate seeks to be proven right. And we pride ourselves on trying our best to be analysts. Look, every time you make a call, you'd like to be right. But when you're not right, that's a really amazing opportunity to learn. And one of our big sort of ahas in the second half of 2023 was connecting those two dots. The US did not go into recession precisely because it is a hydrocarbon producing powerhouse. The shale revolution has added 2.5 Saudi Arabias to the US energy mix, the vast majority of which is trapped and or used here, which feeds a pretty decent manufacturing sector, unlike other petrostates who just have the commodities to rely on. The US has all manner of downstream manufacturing, chemicals and automotives and fertilizers and you name it. And today, at $1.65 per million BTU natural gas is selling in the US for the energy equivalent price of $10 a barrel oil. And if you plug 2.5 Saudi Arabias into a manufacturing sector, it's unlikely, even at 5% interest rates, that economy is going to suddenly go into a recession. And I think that was a big aha for us. I still think the vast majority of analysts don't really understand the critical role that energy plays in the economy. They view energy as just another input into the economy. We have a different view. And that was the big story of 2023. The US kept smashing production records for natural gas and oil and petroleum products. We had record refinery runs, cheap coal. You mix all those things in with elite universities, all of the deep water ports and river systems and fertile farmland and all of the other inherent advantages that Peter Zeihan will tell you makes America great. That's pretty tough to overcome if you're in the recession camp, which we were in. And so having gotten both calls wrong, we decided to try to understand why. And so that was the big sort of second half saga for us.
Yeah, I have one of your posts pulled up over here. It's called Atlas Won't Shrug, and there's a section here that follows the thread that you were literally just talking about, and it says, quote, energy is not an input into the economy, it is the economy. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, if you go on to read the rest of that post, it says humanity organizes its economic activities to ensure a steady growth in the extraction and exploitation of primary energy. Because energy is life, standards of living are defined by how much energy is available to be exploited. And most importantly, all humans ever are perpetually seeking a higher standard of living. And when the introduction of that piece, we catalog a parade of catastrophes that have occurred since the 1970s. Nixon took us off the gold standard, and the Shah of Iran was overthrown. We had the Yom Kippur War in between, and the embargo against the West by OPEC, and the 1980s brought the war between Iran and Iraq, and then of course Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and we had 1 million troops in the Middle East in short order. We had the Asian financial crisis. We had the ruble default in the late 90s. We had the connected long-term capital management collapse as a consequence of the ruble default. 9/11 happened. The war on terrorism. We destabilized Syria. We destabilized Libya. All manner of negative consequences. Afghanistan collapsed. We had COVID. All of these things happened in the last 50 years since Nixon took the US off the gold standard. And yet, as we showed in the piece, the total primary energy consumed by humans grows in a upwardly sloping, gentle sine wave. And it's because all humans everywhere want a higher standard of living. The human endeavor requires an ever-increasing amount of primary energy, and so it shall be. And this is our big aha. The further we regress from that primary energy upward sloping sine wave, the quicker we'll snap back to it. And this, of course, was a response to a series of pieces that we've had when we wrote a piece that we thought was kind of a throwaway piece called Pea Cheapo is a Myth late last year. And it's stirred up this hornet's nest of angry response. Like we were kind of shocked. Like there's people who have tied their entire life identities to this concept. And we come at this problem from an above ground chemical background with 20 years experience in the industry. And this concept of peak cheap oil, I mean, it's just, these are ultimately techno-pessimists who underestimate the human potential for ingenuity. I feel bad for such people because they've literally tied their livelihoods to it. It's not coming. It's not going to happen. We'll figure out a way. We always have, and we always will.
One question I have for you on that energy consumption thread is you were saying that it's tied to standard of living. Have you analyzed or thought about the tie to an expanding population versus standard of living or vice versa?
Oh, sure. So you could do these very famous charts, and we've done them, where you plot energy use per capita versus GDP per capita. There are no rich countries that are energy poor. And in fact, ultimately, energy is the economy, as we say in the piece. And look, the human endeavor is a constant, unrelenting struggle against the forces of entropy. Disorder is spontaneous. Right angles do not appear naturally in the environment. In order to have a high standard of living, you need to impose order on your local environment. And it, by the law of thermodynamics, necessitates that you must harness primary energy and ultimately waste heat. You can't, to balance, the energy equations, in order to have order, you need to waste heat. And the economy is basically one giant heat wasting machine. Abandon your house for a year and you get a sense of the forces of entropy. Your home requires constant maintenance. Check the roofs, make sure no animals are getting into it, and cut back the shrubbery and all of the things that go into running your home. Painting the exterior, all of this stuff. You do these things because left on its own, your house would eventually devolve into a chaotic mess. Whereas order is the opposite of chaos. And to create and maintain order requires a constant stream of primary energy. And if you look at the global south and you ponder the 4 to 5 billion people currently living at 7th, 6th, or 5th of the energy that we use here in the West, all of those people would love nothing more than to be able to waste as much energy as we do. And I mean waste in the most neutral sense. You can't have order without wasting heat. And who are we to deny them? This prospect that the world is just going to do without, I think, is fundamentally anti-human.
How do you decipher the relationship between energy as a contributor to standard of living versus something like technology, or is energy a feed to technology in your perspective here?
You can't have technology without energy. What's powering the server rooms? What's powering the data rooms? Who is literally providing the food to the brilliant entrepreneurs and programmers and startup founders and so on that are creating all of this amazing technology? That's why energy is different. Energy is different than labor because you can't have labor without energy. The people working need to eat. Food is a derivative of energy. Clean water is a derivative of energy. And so during times of energy abundance, where you have excess energy, can be reasonably well modeled as an input into the economy like all the others. But during times of energy crises is where this, where there's a shortage of energy. And look, if you just take a step back, we know that if oil goes to $200 a barrel, what happens? We trigger a recession. We know that Germany screwed up its energy policy. It's deindustrializing. It's in the middle of a recession. The UK doesn't produce hardly any of its own energy. It's a victim of the energy crisis. It's in a recession. If the lack of energy is a catalyst for economic malaise, what does it mean in the US to have added 2.5 Saudi Arabia since 2010 to mostly its domestic energy mix? Have you been to Saudi Arabia? Like this, the sidewalks are paved in gold. When you are an energy superpower, you're wealthy. And then when you're an energy superpower who has forward integrated world-class manufacturing base to feed that advantageous energy to, all the homes in the US that are heated with natural gas are heating their homes at unbelievably cheap prices today. All of the cogeneration facilities that are heavy manufacturing centers across the US are experiencing windfall cost reductions compared to their global competitors. You plug 2.5 Saudi Arabias into a pretty strong manufacturing sector with all of the other geo advantages that we described earlier. It's very hard to imagine why it would be that a recession would suddenly and spontaneously materialize. And we got it wrong. Let's understand why we got it wrong. I think we have a pretty good theory.
Yeah, I think the interesting part of that theory, though, at least to me, is you guys have a lot of expertise. You guys have a fair sized team. I don't know how big your team is, obviously, but you have a lot of smart people, is the punchline. And it's interesting to me that you guys seem to come across this last year as compared to some other time when you guys were analyzing the prospects of recession. What do you think led you guys to coming up to this concept last year versus some other period in time?
Look, the Fed raised rates from 0 to 5% in the snap of a finger, and nothing broke. And I could tell you that if you would have asked us that in 2022, we would have said things would break. They didn't. So I think as an analyst, look, if you're a content creator in the finance energy world and you produce at the volume and cadence that we do, you're going to get some things right. We've got a lot of things right. I'm proud of the things we got right. We got the sanctions right, for example, from the earliest days. I think that's one of our best calls. But you're going to get some things wrong. And how you react to the things you got wrong is the defining characteristic of your team. We intend to be doing this for decades. So what happened in late 2023 and even now, as GDP prints came in hot and jobs reports came in hot, the people that were in the recession camp, many of them, found ever creative ways to try to figure out how this data was wrong or fraudulent. And to me, that reeks of advocacy, not analysis. I mean, at some point you have to trust some data. Does the government massage the data for political reasons? Sure. But like there is a manufacturing construction boom going on in the US. And in the next 2 job prints, we're going to see ever increasing manufacturing jobs as those construction projects wrap up and the people who are going to work in those factories, start checking in. If you get something wrong, you have to try to understand why, and that's how you get better. And if you're stuck on insisting that every jobs report is made up, oh, look at the part-time versus the full-time, or look at the seasonal adjustments, and so on and so on and so on. I think you can very quickly, lose the chance to learn something. And so we're always more than willing to be wrong as long as we learn. We have a philosophy here, and we're putting out a piece a couple of days from after we're recording this called Loose Ends, where every 30 to 40 pieces we like to look back at what we wrote and see what we got right and what we got wrong, and admit our mistakes and explain to our subscribers why we made them and what we learned from them. I think this is very healthy. We intend to be in this business for decades. And the only thing worse than being wrong is having no view, so long as you are willing to show your homework and to authentically embrace why it is that you got something wrong so that you can implement that mindset of continuous improvement. And that is one of our brand ambitions. Our long-term subscribers know this is always how we have behaved. and how we intend to continue to behave. And I think it's pretty healthy. It's a great way to be, because that way you don't need to worry about what if I got something wrong. Because if I got something wrong, that's just going to be an opportunity for me to explain to our subscribers what it is we got wrong, why, and what if we learn from it. So our mistake management philosophy has 4 parts. Mistakes shall be rare, admitted to, corrected, and learned from. It's just that simple.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. To be clear, I'm not harping on whether the any call is right or wrong. To be honest, from my perspective, the idea of judging the merit of something based on right or wrong is, at least in this context with economic systems that are like wildly complex, that's less interesting to me. The part that I was really honing in on there was, what do you think led to you guys coming across this change last year compared to another point in time? And it sounds like the summary of that was the rate change environment was very unique, and that was the catalyst for the assessment there.
The lack of a follow through of a recession once the rates were hiked so
Post the rate.
violently, right?
Got it.
So you see, Powell takes it from 0 to 5. And if you look at the GDP prints, like show me on the chart where Powell, raised the rates, you can't find it. And so one interpretation is the data's all made up. That's fine. Another interpretation is, wow, something is fundamentally different here. What's going on? And then we realized, sort of an aha moment, as the US shale patch kept producing record print after record print, that maybe these two things were connected. You can't, on the one hand, understand why it is that Germany is deindustrializing, because they have totally screwed the pooch on their energy policy. And then look at the US producing 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products a day, 105 BCF of natural gas a day, more coal than it burns, all the nuclear fleet humming along at 90% capacity factors, and say to yourself, this is an environment that is conducive to a recession. Just isn't. So it isn't. That there it was, staring us in the face. And look, we got it wrong. And when we told our subscribers, when we came, and the big realization for us came in November, to give you a bit more detail. So every month we have a pro tier, who, in addition to our articles, they get a monthly Doom Zoom, which is usually a 40-slide presentation from us, but can also be a similarly length publication or a presentation from an expert in a field. Like this month, we're going to record, hopefully tomorrow, a uranium supply chain expert talking to us about the journey from ore to fuel and all the nuances in between. So we do that once a month. And in November, we decided to do a deep dive on the global natural gas market, and it was called Simple Molecule Complex Markets. And after doing the research for that, we went all around the world. Like not physically, but we looked at Qatar, we looked at Saudi Arabia, we looked at Europe, we looked at North America, we looked at Australia and Russia, and South America. And then we came to the conclusion that there was a glut of natural gas coming, and that the world had pivoted from energy scarcity to energy abundance. And we often say from the beginning of Doomberg, the most important question an analyst must ask themselves about an economy is that economy currently in a state of energy abundance or energy deficit? And by the way, the very pondering of that question implies 2 possible answers. And we came to prominence during an energy crisis. So for the vast majority of time that Doomberg has been a thing, the world was short energy. It's no longer short energy. We came to that conclusion in November. That was a profound one for us. And so we did the Doom Zoom for our pro tier. Then we wrote a full article called Liquefied Natural Glut. And then, because this was a significant change in our view, we sent to all of our paying subscribers for free a copy of that November Doom Zoom. And then we've since followed it up with several pieces like Slick Landing, which explains why the US has not fallen into a recession, and so on. Like if we have a change in view, we want our subscribers to know it. But really the turning point for us was in November. We had seen these hot GDP prints. We'd seen the hot job prints. And then concurrently, we were studying the natural gas market for our pro tier, and we came to the realization, like, wait a minute, natural gas is 25% of global primary energy, and we're swimming in it. We're not short energy anymore. And what does that mean? Well, that might explain why the US didn't fall into a recession, for example.
I see. So the first thing is I have to give a shout out to Doom Zoom. It's just so great. I love the branding on that. I love that. You also, as you were talking about this, you reminded me of a quote one of my mentors used to say to me, which was a wise man changes his opinion, a fool never does. So
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
seems apropos here. Now, going back to this idea of a recession. So it sounds like, at least as of thus far, you're of the opinion that we've successfully avoided a recession. Do you view it still as on the table, or do you view it as something that has probably been averted?
I think the odds of a recession before the election, which was the time frame that we had constrained our analysis to, is very low. Biden is a political animal, or at least the people around him who still have access to their full mental capacities are political animals. And they understand, somebody on that team understands commodities, which is why the SPR draining gambit worked out so well ahead of the midterms. And I think this move to put a pause on LNG exports, which will signal to the US market that a glut might be coming, and has really dampened, at least contributed to the dampening of a drawdown in the natural gas futures curve here in the US. By the way, we originally interpreted that incorrectly, and that would be the lead point that we make in the piece that we publish later this week about grading ourselves on the past 30 to 40 pieces. They understand that cheap natural gas is good for the economy, and they want to do everything they can for the US to avoid a recession ahead of the midterms. Ahead of the president's election this time. And so I think they will be successful. And look, this is not a partisan statement. If you hate Biden and you think Trump, was done wrong in the last election, and you hope that he wins this time, you have to be cognizant of the fact that somebody on the Biden team has made a shrewd move, first in draining the SPR for raw political purposes, and now in keeping the world's largest source and cheapest source of hydrocarbons stuck in the US. Somebody understands what's going on. When Joe had full access to his mental capabilities, I remember interacting with Senator Biden back in the day when I was in industry, and he always had a visceral understanding for the price of gasoline at the pump and what it meant for national political figures. And so I think it's dangerous to underestimate your political opponents, assuming that perhaps most of your listeners would fall on the conservative side. I think the fact that the recession hasn't materialized is a net tailwind for the incumbents. If Republicans were in office and no recession materialized when one was expected, that would be bullish for them as well. The incumbents have home field advantage, and they are doing whatever they can to avoid a recession. And I think you need to factor that into your models, period. Whatever it makes you feel about the outcome, like this is reality that needs to be properly incorporated in how you think about things.
If you were to steelman the argument for a recession to then come back on the table, what would that look like?
Oh, you could imagine that the property collapse in China and the deindustrialization of Europe and political polarity in the US leading to societal disruptions. I mean, I don't think that we're free and clear of any possible downside. I'd say, like, all things being equal, plugging 2.5 Saudi Arabias into a manufacturing base is not an environment that's conducive to a recession. But there's all kinds of ways we can screw it up from here. And if we do, our prediction that we probably won't before the election will have been wrong, which is fine because we have a protocol to manage such things. But I think, a total collapse of China, which is possible, and our export partners and import trading partners struggling as much as they are. Like the US is an island right now of economic strength. But you can imagine scenarios where, despite the energy tailwinds, we still manage to find ourselves in a recession.
Yeah, definitely. So thinking of those kinds of scenarios, what would you postulate as the most viable if it were to occur? Again, in a steelman context. And for those that might not be familiar with that, we're playing the other side of the argument just to explore the idea.
Always invert. Yeah, always invert. And so I think the most likely is a sort of upheaval in China. I mean, I do think that Xi Jinping runs a sort of Stalin-esque form of government where nobody tells him the truth. And history teaches us that such systems tend to be very metastable and can collapse rather quickly. And the property situation, the stock market gyrations in China, they're such a huge part of the global economy right now that a sudden sort of crisis in China could be a catalyst. Now, it should be said that people have been predicting this since 60 Minutes first exposed the ghost cities a decade ago. I remember being in China and touring a ghost city and thinking, oh my God, this is all a facade that's going to collapse. That was a long time ago and nothing has collapsed. It's the functional equivalent of arguing about the pyramid scheme that is Social Security. Yes, we all know it is, but yet the checks keep going out every year. The U.S. is a cesspool of waste and mismanagement and huge deficits and the fiscal cliff and all of these things, and yet Treasury auctions keep going off, at reasonable terms. So, until it happens, it won't happen, and if it does happen, it would be catastrophic. I do think we're keeping a close eye on China. And the problem with China is it is impossible for a Western analyst to make any sense of the data. We have lots of friends in China, but even they are hesitant to like send you anything meaningful over WeChat because they know they're being, monitored and all this other stuff. And so China is a giant Ponzi scheme. But if there's one thing we've learned from the 2008 crisis and the European, foreign or the government bond crisis, is that Ponzi schemes with the full support of the government can go on for a very long time. And so, if you pushed us, everybody knows Europe is a basket case and that's priced in. But China's a black box. And so if you're looking for areas of potential surprise, for deviations from what the sort of consensus view is, I think China is probably a decent place to start.
Interesting. Could you outline a little bit more? I know it's a potentially really deep subject, so I'm not looking to put you through that, but just to understand a little bit better your assessment of China as a Ponzi scheme, can you explain that a bit more?
The entire engine, not the entire, a major source of the engine of economic growth in China for the past 20 years has been a speculative bubble in construction, mostly of residential apartments, but entire city infrastructures. There was this need to keep that bubble blowing, and also a thought that there would need to be homes for hundreds of millions of people who eventually came in from the countryside and were sort of not migrant laborers, but became part of the middle and professional class in China. And when I hear people talking about the demographics of China and they sort of do top-down looks, I always try to remember that the number that matters most in China is the size of its middle class, and is that growing? And the middle class can be joined by any age group, as soon as they ascend the economic ladder. So I wouldn't underestimate China, but there are thousands of large, empty apartment buildings for whom speculation on the level of what we saw in the U.S. housing market before the collapse, like 2006, 2007, a huge amount of individual savings, i.e. household net worth in China, is tied to what I believe to be air pockets. Yes, you own claim to apartment 281 of building X26 in Ghost City A14. Nobody wants that. And you have it marked in your books at $1 million. And then you just sold it to somebody else for 1.1. Ponzi schemes require ever fresh sources of capital before they ultimately collapse. And this one is perhaps the greatest in the history. People have been warning about it for as long as we've been paying attention to China. And so it's one of those Chicken Little type situations. But it is real. Like, I've seen them, I've been there. And it's awe-inspiring. It's jaw-dropping when you see an entire city designed, centrally planned from scratch, built to modern specifications. The copper and the concrete and the wood and the finished carpentry and the plumbing, all of it built for nothing. Just sits there. And then it becomes a vehicle for speculation. And the speculation is rampant. And then all of those asset values are marked to market and perhaps used as collateral for debt. And so when you look at the stock market collapse in China, and you look at the collapse of the various, construction companies and so on, it's pretty hard to imagine how the CCP keeps a handle on things. Now, they have the full weight of government behind them and the military behind them and the desire to keep extending and pretending. And so maybe this isn't the year. But it seems clear that at the heart of all of this is very little in the way of fundamental economic. These investments aren't in producing assets. They're in assets that are basically then become vehicles for speculation. And it is staggering. Like in the years where I was traveling to China, you could see the change. And like, if it's important to like go to these places. People are making fun of Tucker Carlson because of his trip to Moscow and how impressed he was with the subway and the grocery stores and how beautiful Moscow is as a city. Well, I would say most of the people making fun of Tucker have never actually traveled to these major cities. And as you do travel around the world, you see the differences and you get a sense. Now, of course, some of it is managed. And yes, Western business people get treated differently than the locals and all of that stuff, but there is still something very visceral about traveling there. And one of the ways this manifests for me is, and we've written about this from the earliest days, this techno arrogance that we have in the West that the Chinese and the Indians and the Russians would be unable to keep the Russian energy complex going in the face of Western sanctions. It just reeked of ignorance. I toured the major universities in India and China and lectured at some of them, and you see the army of petroleum engineers that China's putting out every year and how difficult it is to get into IIT, the IIT school system in India, and how everybody I ever met in my life who had a degree from Moscow State was just a genius. We used to call it the genius school. We underestimate these people at our own peril. And by the way, let's take a look at the US university system in comparison. Like, who are we kidding? So, until you go there and you see it and you live it, and you feel it, you touch it, you eat with the people, you stay with the people. My friend Nate Higgins, who probably has different views than we do, great YouTuber and thinker, just spent I think 6 or 7 weeks in India, and his response to having been there for the first time resonated with me because I've been to India many times, and I have sympathy for him, or not sympathy. I can understand how he could be so blown away by actually going and visiting. And if you don't go and you don't visit, you don't know. You just don't. And so, like, you can make fun of Tucker all you want. At least he had the to go. And he scored an interview with Putin. And I watched it, and so did a billion other people. And it was interesting to me. I think Putin got a lot of stuff wrong, but I wanted to hear it. And kudos to Tucker for having done it.
Definitely. On that exact thread, I actually think that that's one of the coolest things about people that join the military, is because it gives them a chance to at least see some other places. Because I do find Americans in general, and I'm a red-blooded American, I'm a patriot, but I do think a lot of Americans are very close-minded, and we don't have a respect for other places, what other places value, how other places behave, and we use our value system for them. All that kind of stuff gets really interesting to me.
Yeah, I would say a very important follow-on to that, which is because nobody's gone anywhere and nobody served in the military, we have a very loose relationship with war. Mm-hmm. And I think we would do well to have a little bit of higher bar to pick and fights with powerful people around the world. You go into a bar today and there's a guy there, and he's got a cutoff jean jacket on. He's ripped, 6'4", looks like he was tight end for a D1 school, and he's got tattoos up and down his arms. And he's looking around and saying, if anybody sits in this stool next to me, I'm going to punch him in the face. So are you just going to go sit in that stool? No. Give it a little bit of wide berth. Like, we live in a dangerous world with people who could do violence to us. And the exact same mental processing you do when you walk into a bar or you walk into a public situation where your gut instinct, your spidey sense tells you that, something might go down here and I'm going to like keep my back to the wall and keep an eye on the exit. We ought to have that in our foreign policy. And I think too many of the people in DC have too low a regard for the cost of war because they're not the ones paying, cashing those checks, and have too little appreciation for the other cultures of the world. And here we are, World War III, basically, and we've sleepwalked into it. And that's, I think, a significant challenge.
Talk to me about that World War III comment.
Well, I mean, I often wonder when everybody sort of in the US, for example, thought World War II began. And I think they would all probably say when Pearl Harbor started. But if you go back in history, you'll see World War II actually really began when Japan invaded China in the 30s. And everything that followed from that led to the dominoes that became World War II. And I wonder when historians will look back at this time and say World War III started. We have a proxy war between Ukraine and Russia, which is essentially a war between NATO and Russia, which is essentially a war between the US and Russia. That's a hot war. I've spent the last couple of months going down the rabbit hole of these mappers who are chronicling the day-to-day ebbs and flows of the line of contact between Russia and Ukraine. And they probably won't write about it, but it's interesting to me. And because of the connections to the energy markets is how I sort of got into this, because Russia is such an important, energy exporter. And then when you compare what you can learn just from open source from people, and you sort of categorize people into their sort of Russia focus or Ukraine bent, or people that try to be down the middle. And then you could be 2-3 weeks ahead of the mainstream media. And then you see how things are characterized in the media, totally inconsistent with reality on the ground. You begin to question, of course, what you're being fed. We're in World War III. Like, we have that conflict in Ukraine, which, by the way, when I watch those videos, you see that Putin is just leveling these towns and these villages, right? I mean, step one is they carpet bomb them. Step two is they send in the stormtroopers. And then step three is they occupy them and raise the Russian flag. And they're just doing it over and over and over again. And they've got complete domination of the air. And I think one of the underappreciated catalysts, say, or black swan events for 2024 is a rapid collapse of Ukraine and Zelensky being ousted in a coup. I think that's real. I think that's possible. And it's being totally downplayed in the West. And market participants need to have that on the radar. Now we have a kinetic conflict in the Middle East. And we're the ones arming Israel. And much of the rest of the Middle East is uniting against the US. It's not being reported at all how we are being pummeled at the United Nations, both in the Security Council and I think eventually at the floor of the General Assembly. The world is lining up against our support for Israel, whatever your views on the war are. Like, again, it's a controversial topic. I've spent a lot of time studying Israel and its history, but just agnostically as an analyst, we're losing the public relations war here. And then you have the tensions with China. And by the way, if China is that black swan event with the property collapse and so on, the CCP will create a war. That's what dictators do. And so we have this strange cyber attack last week, which kind of caught our eye. Like, literally as I'm talking to you, trending on X, which I still use as a news following source, is World War III. And I think we're a lot closer to World War III. Look, we have the Houthis shutting down the Red Sea. We have the war in Gaza. We have a potential spread to the north. We have a potential direct kinetic conflict with Iran. And by the way, over the weekend, I'm watching, and this is not reported in the US at all. I'm watching geolocated videos of $10,000 drones tracking billion-dollar Patriot missile systems and guiding cheap missiles to destroy them. I've seen 3 such videos in the past week. These run $1 billion a pop. And cheap drone warfare is changing the battlefield. Have we caught up to this? As Congress debates $60 billion to send into that, inferno. It may be that that's what we should do. I'm not making a case either way, but I'm watching billion-dollar Patriot missiles being destroyed by weaponry that I personally could afford to buy. Of course, I would never, I'm not going to engage in arms dealing, but I could afford to destroy $1 billion Patriot missile today. And that's profound. And I don't think our bureaucracy has caught up to this. And a big aha for us is the same architects of our insane sanctions policy and Europe's crazy energy policy are the political force behind the military strategy. And look, as you probably know, a military is only as good as its political leaders. Like the troops can be well trained, but they're told what to do. And if those decisions are terrible, the troops suffer. And if you have very bad political leadership, I don't care how good the military is, that military is in trouble, assuming they follow orders. And so we're at a very dangerous point here in the West. We have a president who I think objectively is not all there, and who is insisting on sleepwalking us into a major war with at least one and potentially two, nuclear superpowers. And I'm old enough to remember when wars required a vote of Congress. So it's scary times.
Based on that, I can follow a lot of your train of thought. How do you define World War III? Like, how do you define a world war? Because to me, there's a slight disconnect there, at least in terms of the way that you're laying out the timeline. Before, when you were saying it, maybe I misheard, but before when you're saying that we're in World War III.
Look, what's going on right now is, for at least the third time in the past 100 years, Russia is marching from east to west and raising the lands as they move towards Western Europe. That war is being funded by the US. So in the prior two times that this has happened in the past 100 years, we were allies with them, and the opponent was Germany. Now we're allied with Germany, and we're funding basically Ukrainian resistance. And if you doubt that, you can just see how quickly Ukrainian resistance has been falling as weapon supply has dried up from the US. And of course, that makes total sense. We are funding and providing the weapons for Israel's war in the Middle East. Again, whatever you think of October 7th, whatever your views are on Palestinians' right to self-determination and all of those things, forget about all of that. There is a hot war going on in the Middle East, and we are supplying weapons for one side, which means we're at war with the other side. We're not supplying weapons to the Palestinians. Ergo, the US is at war with the Palestinians. I mean, I think we should just say it, and we should debate whether that's the right thing to do, but that is what we're doing. And then we're gearing up for a confrontation with China vis-a-vis Taiwan. So it feels to me like 1941 before Pearl Harbor. We were supporting the UK, Lend-Lease, the whole 9 yards. We were supporting certain parts of a European war, which means we're effectively at war with the other side. We were supporting the Russians in their war with Germany. And we were supporting China in their war with Japan. And then when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, we became officially part of the war. But if all of that is true, then World War II actually started when Japan first invaded China in the early 30s. And Hitler came to power in 33. And all of those events that sort of led to what we now call World War II. I see the echoes of that pattern here today.
I see. Yeah. From my ignorant perspective, I think that suffers a little bit from hindsight, because then if you look back at any conflict between two countries that then didn't have the rest of the world join in, then we've had
But you would agree that if we end up having a hot war with China, then the collective action of the past 3 years was probably, in hindsight, will be labeled as World War III. I mean,
I would agree that that's a catalyst for the world war, but I wouldn't consider that world war, because
let me give you a different view. 110,000 people died of fentanyl overdose last year in the US. China makes all the precursors for that.
Mhm.
And if you look at where the fentanyl deaths are, it's basically the US and Canada. How is
Mhm.
that not a chemical warfare act by China on the US? It's a piece we've pondered writing. We haven't written it yet. We've done some studying of it. They know where the precursor factories are. They know how to shut. Nothing happens in China without the CCP's approval.
Mhm.
Drugs finding their way to directly into the US and through Mexico are laced with a knowingly deadly poison that is
Mhm.
killing 100,000 military-age people a year. I mean, just because it's not tanks and artillery and planes doesn't mean we're not at war. Just this week, we got another balloon flying over the US. I don't know what any of that means, but like cyber attack last week, like there are the modern embodiment of war between superpowers need not necessarily be the traditional game of Axis. You know, like 100,000 people died last year from something that China is doing on purpose to the American people. Are we at war with China?
I would say no, we're not.
No.
Yeah.
I would say perhaps
Because
we should ponder whether we are, because they might be at war with us and we don't know it.
Sure. Yeah. And I think we're in direct competition to your point. I think with places like that, we continually prod one another to find weaknesses. But again, just from my layman's perspective, war is a defined thing. So
How do you think the CCP would react if we were doing something that we knew were killing 100,000 of their citizens a year?
I'm not convinced that we're not.
Yeah, well, that's fair enough. There you go. Even more proof. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
My view is in 10 years and 20 years time, we will look back at 2022, 2023, and 2024 and characterize this time period as the beginning of World War III. I hope I'm wrong, by the way,
Yeah.
because I have, draft eligible children.
Yeah. I mean, it really is a fascinating perspective, and I enjoy you sharing it with me because it continues to elucidate how complex of an environment that we're in, where even you and I were talking about a specific term, just a term, and we
Sure,
have different
semantics.
opinions.
Yeah.
Yeah. And meanwhile, behind what we're talking about are just massive pieces moving. And to your point, I do fully agree with you that this time could absolutely be a precursor. When you look at the relationship between the US, Russia, and China, kind of that trio, what comes to mind?
I think a tragedy of missed opportunities comes to mind. I think in a world where the three great powers behaved in a manner that sort of prioritized mutual respect, things could have evolved quite differently. Um, but they didn't, and things have evolved the way they have. I think, for example, in a piece we wrote late last year, I believe, the Western Hemisphere need not even mess around with Europe or the Middle East or China. We have so much here that we could just do. I'm old enough to remember when the Department of Defense was meant to defend the US. Like, let's start there. What are we doing all over the world and defending, shipping lanes in the Middle East so that China could have access to energy. Let China's Navy take care of the Middle East. If they don't have one, well, they best start build one. Like it. What are we doing?
Do you think
Let's
that we're doing that out of the kindness of our hearts?
No, I do think there is a very strong look. I think Eisenhower is right. I think the military industrial complex in the US is extremely strong and greedy and is pillaging the US Treasury, spending blood that's not theirs. I think our bar to going to war should be much higher. I think Lindsey Graham is one of the most reprehensible figures in modern politics. I see him on Fox News demanding we start carpet bombing Iranian refineries. Like, get in the plane. You do it. Like, what are we doing? Like, you first. Like that. By the way, are you ready for the counterpunch? Like, walk up to that guy at the bar in the sleeveless jean jacket with the ripped muscles and the tattoos, and sit on that stool next to him and put your finger in his face? I mean, go ahead. Let's see how it goes. It's insane. Like we have this view that we're the dominant superpower. We could do whatever we want. And I just don't think that is conducive to world peace or economic development or human prosperity. And I think it risks nuclear war. Like, can we have a vote in Congress, please? It's mind-boggling to me the flippant way in which major US politicians like Lindsey Graham think war is an arcade game and all they got to do is put more quarters in the machine and they can keep playing. Like, we have vulnerabilities. One of the reasons you don't go to war is you might lose it. And Lord knows our track record in this regard in the past few decades has not been a glorious one. I remember people clinging on to US Air Force jets as they flew out of Afghanistan not that long ago. Like, what did we do? And the sacrifice of the countless men and women, largely American soldiers, who died there during that war, what was it for? And how tragic is that? Same thing with Iraq. Same thing with Libya. What are we doing? Like, can we take a beat? Can we take a pause? Can we have a national conversation about the neocons and whether we need to be the world's police? How about we start being the US's police? I don't know.
What are your thoughts on the concept of like a defense in depth? The big thing from military doctrine. I'm curious what your thoughts are on it.
I'm unfamiliar with the term, so maybe you can.
Yeah.
I've not served in the military, which is why I perhaps have a lot of respect for people who have.
From a defensive position, like if my notebook is, this is the border, this is where we are, and then this is where the enemy is. Defense in depth is a concept where we don't want our first lines of defense to be here. We want it to be here and here and here.
Sure.
And
Okay.
here.
I get that. Where does it end? How much is enough? And by the way, like, let's start with our border. We have 10 million people crossing the border today. I've flown into the US countless times and stood in customs and immigration lines and make sure that you have your papers in order and all these other things. And we have 10 million people crossing the border, many of whom are military-aged men. Again, are we in World War III? How many of them are from China? How many of them are from Iran or their proxies? How many of them are from the drug cartels? I saw a story last week where gangs of people that have come over the border are raiding rich neighborhoods in Detroit and bringing their loot back down to Texas. Like, this is coming. Like, 10 million people is a lot. And the disparity between what you and I do, taking your shoes off at TSA and all of that security theater, standing in line for an hour at a time at LaGuardia or pick your favorite airport, Atlanta and O'Hare. Meanwhile, people just strolling across the border. And like, where is national defense? Is that literally not the definition of national defense? The book that you just held up, the binding of that book, is that not, like, doesn't that begin with the US border? And somehow a proxy war in Ukraine matters more than the border between Mexico and Texas?
I think one thing I would offer to that, at least from my perspective, is I think when people talk about these things, we fall into kind of like binary positions, and I'm not sure that I've seen anywhere somebody say, or even in the way that we behave, that one is discreetly more important than the other. Now, I get probably your point based on where the money is flowing, the amount of money, the actions we're taking, those kinds of things. So on that thread, though, what would you suggest for the border, out of curiosity?
I just think, having interacted with US immigration for a fair part of my life, and always try to do so legally, that, like, we have laws for a reason and they should either be enforced or not. And anybody who's crossed the bridge to Canada or, flown in from overseas, and I've flown all over the world, And in every country I've landed, I have to produce my passport. They ask me what I'm doing there. I fill out forms. I am a privileged guest of that government while I'm in their country, which is their national territory, their sovereign territory. And I think a country without borders that it can police is no country at all.
Yeah.
And I understand that there's humanitarian issues and all that, but we used to handle those. And the U.S. has always been a country of immigrants, and the assimilation of immigrants into the country is part of the fabric, the tapestry of what makes this country great. I'm very much for a vibrant, legal immigration system. And even the people that are desperate to get here, they do have rights, and we should treat them with dignity and respect because they're humans, but there has to be law and order. There has to be a system. It can't just be people, hordes of people crawling over barbed wires, most of whom are desperate to just get here and to live the American dream. I am not casting a wide net on the composition of the people that are coming here, but it doesn't take many who are bad apples. The whole point of Customs and Border Control is to prevent bad apples from getting into your country. Like the post 9/11 world is one we've all submitted to because we were afraid of a reoccurrence of what happened on 9/11. So we agree that an uncontrolled border situation is conducive to 13 people figuring out how to get flying lessons and blowing up a bunch of buildings in the US. So if it was worth it for us to give up so many freedoms and to spend so much money and to frankly lose the wars that we have lost, how is it not worth it now? Because we don't know what the next threat's going to be. And so I think it all starts with control at the border. And if you don't have that, then do you really have a country? And so I have deep sympathy and visceral sympathy for the people that are desperate to get to the US, because the US is, look, the direction of flow is the arrow is in one way, right? It's coming here because this is a great place. I understand that, and I have deep sympathy for it. But we have to have rules, we have to have controls, and we have to have processes that make sure that we eliminate or identify the people on terrorist watch lists, for example, who are slipping through the border today, or M13 gang members who are slipping through the border today, or various other cartel members that are slipping through the border today, and they are. It's just undeniable that they are. Like, there will be victims in the U.S. because of that, and this is a failure of government in its most primary duty, which is to defend the nation's borders as it exists and the citizens within it. That's what actually the Department of, quote, Defense is meant to do.
Yeah, I've always thought a big contributing factor is that we have so many holes. Like once somebody is in the US, they're kind of there. It's very difficult to manage that. Because the reason why I asked the question is I agree in terms of needing to control a border, needing to have a defined process. I think fully same page. I think one of the tricky parts is I consider the problem is like, we know it's not solved. And to be clear, I'm not against a physical barrier. I think a physical barrier is good. I think something like that doesn't solve it though. It's not that difficult to circumnavigate something like that. So to me, it seems like there needs to be some sort of structural adjustment within the country to then, go ahead.
I think the first thing we need is an agreement that such things are necessary. And that doesn't exist today. One side, for whatever reason, thinks that an open border is advantageous to them. And so that's like the biggest political issue, is an honest, open discussion about what does it mean to be a country. Like, again, having stood in line for as many hours as I have, like, it's profound to me that we've just decided in this particular instance, the rules don't count. So then why do I have to stand in line at TSA? Right? I mean, why am I taking my shoes off? I'm not the shoe bomber. The government knows who I am. I've done the TSA pre-check. They know all about my internet search history. They know about my bank accounts. They know everything about me. I'm no threat. Right? But still, I take off my shoes and oops, I have an iPad on top of a computer, so my bag gets searched because it looks funny on the screen. And we all pretend like this is making anybody safer on a plane when they know I'm not a threat, right? They have the systems to know I'm not a threat. Believe me, if the government wanted to get rid of me, they'd have no shortage of reasons to do so. Like this is This is the world we live in. And yet we all submit to this kabuki theater of security when we have a completely open border, both in the north and the south, by the way, like people getting into Canada, then coming in from north, same thing. I've been on the Canadian border in a car and interrogated and randomly selected for a full search. And they basically take tools and take apart your car looking for, I don't know, gram of marijuana or whatever. Like, how is this making either side safer? I don't know. I just stand by and let them because I know there's nothing in my car and so on. But they treat us that way, and yet we have this situation that just seems very incongruent. There's something deep and malicious about what's going on that I don't understand. That's my visceral response to your question.
Yeah, interesting. Really interesting. I know that we're up at time here. I had one last question for you. As you're looking out over 2024, what's most interesting to you and why?
I think the thing that's most interesting to me is whether and how fast the Ukraine situation resolves. Because I think, again, many in the West have their heads in the sand as to what's actually going on the ground. And it is readily accessible to anybody who's willing to look and invest the time to have a pretty good understanding of what's going on the ground. And the contrast between what you can learn on your own and how it's portrayed in the major Western media outlets would shock people if they actually took the time to do it. It would really make them ponder who it is that works at these organizations and what is their real agenda. And I actually think part of the success of Doomberg is we are just authentically ourselves. We write what we believe. We're not afraid to be wrong. And we're not beholden to some, messaging that the government would like to put out there. And so that story wraps everything that is interesting to us. It's connected to energy. It's connected to the ever-changing role of the media and in particular, the emergence of sort of micro sources of news where people begin to trust one outlet over another for their own reasons. And instead of having 3 news anchors that dominate the narrative, you have 500-600 major sources of news that people select into their news flow. And in our own small way, for the 210,000 people that subscribe to Doomberg, hopefully we've been able to carve out a bit of an interesting source for them. But I think the biggest disconnect on the board today is how the Western media is portraying the situation in Ukraine, and what we or I happen to think is coming.
Interesting. Time will tell. But
Indeed.
Yeah, absolutely awesome chatting with you. I enjoy the dialogue. I enjoy your perspectives. I always have an opportunity to learn a lot, and so does the audience. So thank you for hanging out. I will throw links to your Substack in the notes below, but is there anywhere else that you want to send people to?
That's where we are, doomberg.substack.com. We're about to embark on a potential rebrand as we were able to eject a squatter from doomberg.com. So now we own that domain name, and we might do a little rebrand there. We'll see in the coming weeks and months ahead. But for now, everything we do is at doomberg.substack.com. And look, I think this conversation probably went in a different direction than we were planning, but I very much enjoyed it, and I appreciated the opportunity to talk about a few things that we probably won't ever write about.
Yeah. I had a blast. I really enjoy these, and it's a great way for other people to hear different perspectives, conversations about complex things. So thank you very much for your time.
Talk to you soon.
Take care.